In this video, we're taking a deep dive into the history of Battlefield, how it came to be, what shaped it, and why it changed multiplayer shooters forever. We'll answer questions like, what games did DICE make before Battlefield? The answer might surprise you. This isn't just a story of a game, it's a story of experimentation, survival, and a studio that chose to build something bigger when the genre told them not to. This is the history of Battlefield. DICE's first foray into video games was, believe it or not, pinball. Yes, from a studio that will later go on to create one of the most influential FPS franchises of all time. At first glance, pinball seems completely disconnected from Battlefield, but for DICE, it was the perfect training ground. Pinball demanded precise physics, consistent frame timing, predictable yet dynamic systems, and perfectly smooth performance at all times. There was really no room for error because a single dropped frame meant it could potentially break the entire experience. The result was Pinball Dreams, which became one of the most celebrated Amiga games of its era and firmly established DICE as a technical powerhouse. But despite its success, this chapter wouldn't last. By the mid-1990s, the Amiga platform was dying, and if DICE wanted to survive, they had to evolve. They pivoted away from 2D development and moved into 3D and console games. Not out of creative ambition, but necessity. Games that would keep the studio alive while they learned entirely new technical disciplines. One of the most important games that came out of this was Hardcore 4x4. This marked DICE's first real step into vehicle simulation, terrain handling, and large 3D environments. It wasn't just about racing, it was about making weight feel real, surfaces feel unpredictable, and movement feel physical rather than scripted. And whether by coincidence or not, DICE was solving problems that will later define Battlefield. How does a vehicle interact with uneven ground? How do you make movement feel physical instead of canned? How do you optimize performance across large, open environments? Now, these weren't shooter problems yet, but very soon they would be. By the late 1990s, DICE was no longer experimenting blindly. They'd survived the collapse of the Amiga, transitioned into 3D, and quietly built a deep understanding of vehicles, physics, and large environments. What they lacked, though, was a clear expression of how these systems could come together. That expression arrived in 1999 with Codename Eagle. Codename Eagle was DICE's first true step into the first-person shooter genre, but it didn't resemble anything else on the market at the time. Instead of tight corridors or arena-style maps, it dropped players into vast outdoor environments. Instead of focusing solely on infantry combat, it treated vehicles as core gameplay systems rather than scripted set pieces. Players could pilot planes, drive tanks, and move across wide landscapes that felt open and unscripted. Most importantly though, Codename Eagle was built with multiplayer at its core. The chaos, the scale, and the unpredictability weren't side effects. They were the point. Each match felt less like a duel and more like an evolving battlefield. In many ways, Codename Eagle was a sandbox shooter before that term was even widely understood. That being said, it wasn't perfect, the technology strained under its ambition, the presentation lacked polish, and the alternate history setting confused a lot of audiences. But under the surface, something crucial was happening. By 1999, DICE had reached a turning point. Codename Eagle had shipped that year, and while it never became a mainstream hit, it revealed something far more important to the studio. Large-scale, combined arms multiplayer wasn't just possible, it was compelling. Players were drawn to the freedom, the vehicles, and the sheer scale, even if the technology struggled to fully support their ambition. At the same time, the first-person shooter genre was being defined by very different games. Titles like Quake 3 Arena and Counter-Strike were rapidly growing in popularity. They represented the peak of competitive FPS design, tight maps, precise gunplay, and carefully balanced encounters. And DICE paid very close attention to this. They didn't want to copy Quake or Counter-Strike, but they understood why those games worked. These lessons mattered because Codename Eagle had struggled in exactly those areas. Inside DICE, the conclusion was clear. Their idea was right, but the execution had to improve. Rather than chasing the competitive arena shooter space, DICE made a deliberate choice. They would take the technical discipline and multiplayer clarity of games like Quake and Counter-Strike and apply to something those games could not: scale. That decision directly led to the creation of Battlefield 1942. Development for Battlefield 1942 began in the early 2000s. DICE rebuilt and optimized the engine that powered Codename Eagle, prioritizing performance. They refined vehicle handling so tanks and aircraft felt responsive instead of clumsy. And they designed maps not as symmetrical arenas, but as believable spaces where combat could emerge naturally. And to ground this ambition, DICE chose World War II as a setting. World War II instantly justified combined arms combat and gave players an intuitive understanding of roles, vehicles, and objectives. It removed abstraction and let the systems speak for themselves. Just as importantly, Battlefield embraced a different definition of skill. While Quake and Counter-Strike rewarded precision and mastery, Battlefield rewarded participation. You didn't need to win every gunfight to matter. Capturing objectives, transporting teammates, repairing vehicles, or supporting a squad were all valid ways to contribute. After years of iteration and refinement, Battlefield 1942 officially launched on September 10, 2002. The centerpiece of Battlefield 1942 was Conquest. Instead of rounds or linear objectives, Conquest was built around control points scattered across massive maps. Teams weren't trying to wipe each other out, they were fighting for territory. Holding more flags drained the enemy's tickets, creating a constant push and pull across Battlefield. This fundamentally changed how players approached combat. You didn't have to hunt kills, you didn't have to win every firefight, you just had to be where the battle mattered. Conquest turned maps into living spaces. Frontlines shifted organically, a fight over one flag could pull players away from another, creating moments of chaos, misdirection, and opportunity. Battles weren't scripted, they emerged. This design reinforced Battlefield's core philosophy: the war was bigger than any single player. Battlefield 1942 also marked the first true introduction of the class system. For the first time in a large-scale multiplayer shooter, players weren't just soldiers, they were roles. Each class existed for a specific purpose on the battlefield. The Scout specialized in long-range combat and reconnaissance. The Assault class formed the backbone of the infantry. The Medic focused on squad revival. And the Engineer was essential to the battlefield's combined arms design. But there was also a class that no longer exists in its original form. The Anti-Tank class was armed with heavy rocket launchers and anti-armor weapons, serving a crucial balancing role. This system was revolutionary at the time because it forced players to think beyond individual skill. Victory depended on squads balancing their composition, scouts to spot, medics to sustain, engineers to maintain vehicles, assault troops to push, and anti-tank units to neutralize armor. Battlefield 1942 didn't just introduce classes, it introduced the idea that everyone mattered, just in different ways. So, you're probably wondering, how did Battlefield 1942 actually perform when it launched? Was it a guaranteed hit? No, not even close. Battlefield 1942 didn't launch on consoles. No PlayStation 2, no Xbox, no Nintendo. Just PC. And that mattered, because in 2002, PC shooters lived or died by word of mouth, LAN parties, and community adoption. Yet despite all of that, within 2 years, Battlefield 1942 sold over 2 million copies worldwide. For a PC-only multiplayer shooter, that was huge. There was no esports scene, no marketing push, and no consoles to rely on. And critically, Battlefield 1942 didn't just succeed, it was celebrated. It earned review scores in the high 80s to low 90s, and by the end of 2002, it had taken home PC Game of the Year honors from multiple outlets. Not because it played it safe, but because it dared to be bigger. Battlefield 1942 proved that scale, vehicles, and player-driven chaos weren't risks, they were the future. After the success of Battlefield 1942, the obvious question wasn't if DICE would make another Battlefield. It was what came next. They could have played it safe, another World War II game with more maps, more vehicles, and same formula, but instead, DICE did something very on-brand for them at the time. They took a risk. In March of 2004, DICE released Battlefield Vietnam, not as a sequel in name, but as a thematic evolution of everything Battlefield 1942 had introduced. And this choice mattered, because Battlefield Vietnam wasn't just a new setting. It was a design challenge. Unlike World War II's clear front lines and large-scale conventional battles, the Vietnam War was asymmetric, chaotic, and unpredictable. Dense jungles replaced open deserts, helicopters became the centerpiece of combat, music, atmosphere, and tone became just as important as gunplay. This was Battlefield learning how to express identity, not just scale. Battlefield Vietnam doubled down on what made 1942 special: large maps, vehicles, and multiplayer-first design, but it also refined the formula. Radio chatter, period music, and faction-specific dialogue gave matches personality, something almost unheard of in multiplayer shooters at the time. Speaking of music, did you know that Battlefield Vietnam is the only mainline Battlefield game that did not use the iconic theme song we know today? You know, the one that goes... When Battlefield Vietnam launched in March 2004, DICE made a conscious decision to trade heroic orchestral themes for period authentic music.
Chris is shipping out tomorrow morning, and he's pretty nervous. I know you enjoy staring like 3,000 feet out into dead space, but you got any good stories I could tell him about how cool Nam is?
You know, there's lots of things you expect in war. Carnage, the sleepless nights. But what they don't prepare you for is the incessant use of Fortunate Son.
Instead of swelling strings and military fanfare, Battlefield Vietnam filled the battlefield with 1960s counterculture and rock. You'd hear tracks like Fortunate Son by Creedence Clearwater Revival, Along the Watchtower by Jimi Hendrix, and White Rabbit by Jefferson Airplane, blasting from vehicle radios. Music wasn't confined to menus, it moved with the player. The most noticeable change in Battlefield Vietnam was movement. In Battlefield 1942, travel was slow and deliberate. Getting from one objective to another took time, and the flow of battle felt methodical. But Battlefield Vietnam accelerated everything. Helicopters became central to gameplay, not just as transport, but as strategic tools. Squads could spawn directly into helicopters, redeploy rapidly, and control the pace of matches. Battlefield became vertical, and air mobility defined success. This change fundamentally altered map control. Where 1942 emphasized wide open spaces, Vietnam introduced denser environment, jungles, hills, and narrow valleys. Sightlines were shorter, infantry combat mattered more, ambushes became common, positioning often outweighed raw firepower. The result was a battlefield that felt less predictable and more reactive. Map design also evolved. Battlefield 1942's map encouraged free-form sandbox play. Vietnam, however, leaned more heavily into front lines, creating clearer territorial pushes and defensive choke points. When Battlefield 1942 launched, its class system was simple and quite revolutionary. Each class existed to fulfill a specific battlefield function. Victory came from coordination, not individual dominance. Among those roles, one stood out: the anti-tank class. This class existed for one purpose: to make sure vehicles didn't completely dominate the battlefield. But the system had its limitations. Classes in 1942 were often narrow and situational. The anti-tank class was devastating against armor, but once vehicles were destroyed or absent, its usefulness dropped sharply. By the time Battlefield Vietnam released, the class system started to change. Rather than treating anti-tank as a standalone role, ICE absorbed anti-armor responsibilities into broader classes. Engineers and combat-focused infantry roles gained explosives, mines, and anti-vehicle tools, allowing them to remain effective when armor wasn't present. The anti-tank class didn't disappear because it wasn't important, it disappeared because it was too narrow. Financially, Battlefield Vietnam performed well, but not explosively. It sold well, especially among the existing Battlefield community, but it did not match the breakout momentum of Battlefield 1942. By the mid-2000s, selling a few million copies as a PC-exclusive shooter was still impressive, but the bar had moved. The market was growing faster and competition was arriving from an unexpected direction. That competition was Call of Duty. When Call of Duty launched in late 2003, it approached World War II from the opposite angle. Instead of sandbox multiplayer, it focused on tight, cinematic single-player missions. Critically and commercially, Call of Duty gained rapid momentum. It appealed not just to hardcore PC players, but to a broader audience that wanted intensity without complexity. And now suddenly, Battlefield wasn't alone. This shift mattered. Battlefield Vietnam arrived at the moment when shooters were beginning to split into two paths: sandbox-driven multiplayer and scripted cinematic experiences. Vietnam leaned harder into atmosphere, immersion, and identity, but it didn't fundamentally expand Battlefield's audience in the way 1942 had. Call of Duty, meanwhile, was doing exactly that. Strategically, it made something clear. Battlefield needed to evolve again. The franchise couldn't rely on scale alone, because while Battlefield had proven what multiplayer shooters could be, Call of Duty was redefining what they needed to be to compete. And that realization would directly shape DICE's next move, because the next Battlefield wouldn't just respond to its past, it would respond to its newest rival. And that's where we leave it for this video, guys. Hope you enjoyed this deep dive into the history of Battlefield. In part 2, we'll explore the rest of Battlefield's mainline entries and how the series continued to evolve over time. If you like this video, leave a comment, drop a like, and subscribe if you want to see more gaming content like this. Until then, I'll see you in the next one.